Hi, I'm Shannon Stewart, GFEM's Senior Data Scientist, and today I'm going to take you through how I wrote our forced labor automated risk estimator, which is a predictive tool that helps us automatically categorize the risk of forced labor at the firm level. In this video, I'm going to take you through the datasets that I selected and gathered for this project. The basic principle behind the tool is an effort to use the minimum viable publicly available data that pertains to the management and operations of firms to look for a signal that indicates a high risk of forced labor. Often, these signals come from proxies that indicate financial health of the firm or the organization of its supply chain relationships. The tool is based off of my experience doing something quite similar to detect the leading indicators that a food or medicine had been purposefully adulterated. Some of the risk drivers I identified in that work are applicable to the case of forced labor and generalized business risk, such as counterfeiting, failure to deliver on purchase orders, or product quality issues. Some of these risks may be more specific to forced labor. The two major categories of data that we're going to be looking at are developmental data and training data, and we're going to go through both in turn. I've selected India as a first use case geography because of the wide availability of data in English. The underlying approach is generalizable and it does not need to be constrained to specific geographies. But for practical purposes, it's necessary to narrow your scope from all of the supply chain data in the world down to something a little bit more manageable. The first iterations I wrote of similar tools, I used data from China, some of which has become unavailable in recent years. And so India was our best candidate for the largest availability of free and open data. I've also circumscribed this project to the garment industry. The reason for this is that we knew that we would need to structure the training data ourselves, and we couldn't begin with a scope of every case of forced labor that could be linked to a firm in India. It's just too much. And so I'm going to show you how I created a list of the universe of potential garment and textile firms in India and how I created a structured data set of training data. I wanted to take as a starting point the largest possible universe of firms that we could identify who may be involved in the industry. And this is in contrast to trying to look at a specific firm's supply chain. Often, risk creeps in through unauthorized subcontracts. And if a buyer isn't vigilant, it can be difficult to detect and prevent that issue. We may not ever be able to capture, for instance, home-based production or companies that are completely unregistered and off the books. But by creating an index of all registered companies in India, I think we have a good foundation to begin. And the issue of unauthorized subcontracting is something that we can revisit once we have some more data. So, to begin, I sought to gather the largest index of firms in the Indian garment and textile industries. And I wanted to show you here that the Ministry of Corporate Affairs in India makes these data available. So here's an example of master details of companies LLPs registered, and they do them by month. So here's a spreadsheet that you might see. We're just looking at this for the data fields right now. This would be the name of the firm, the date of its founding, its location, its status, and industrial activity, the description of that industrial activity in English, its initial capitalization, number of partners, or number of designated partners, number of partners, state, district, address, and email. But this just goes month by month, looking at new companies that have been incorporated. Instead, we want the full index, which luckily India also makes this available in a structured way. If we go to data.gov.in, which is where Indian open government data is stored, and we search for company master data, we get a list of spreadsheets like this. And I've already downloaded one because they're many megabytes and they take a long time to download. But here's an example of what you get from that. So you get a unique corporate identification number, the company name, its status, its class, that is, whether it's public or private, a company category and subcategory, date of registration, registered state, authorized capital, paid up capital, an industrial class. This is a five-digit code. And I can show you the codex for that is called the National Industrial Classification. And you can download the codex from the Ministry of Statistics and Program Implementation. So let's go back to that. Okay. This also has the principal business activity, registered office address, registrar of companies, an email address, and indications of the latest registration. Another good starting place for this type of data is business intelligence and trade websites. So an example of this in India would be Zauber Corp. And I'm just going to put in the name of a company that I know exists in India so we can look at its profile. So this shows us Sapphire Textile Mills Private Limited is a private incorporated on 18 November 2004. It's classified as a non-government company and is registered at the Registrar of Companies, Mumbai. Its authorized share capital is 1 million and its paid up capital is 100,000. It's involved in spinning, weaving, and finishing of textiles. And the other useful thing here is that it lists the company directors. And each director has a unique identification number here. So when you're comparing two different companies, you can know for sure that the directors themselves are the same. And they're not just people that have the same name. So this is going to be useful when we start to look at consolidating these into single entities. For the tool, I used the Zauber Corp data as the major index. And the reason that I did that is because of this link that it automatically makes with the directors. And we just scraped the data for garments and textiles companies and structured that using regular expressions. So we can also find interesting and useful data from trade databases. And a good example of that would be Panjiva here. Panjiva is a database where the fundamental unit of information is a bill of lading. The bill of lading describes somewhere between 1 and 3 steps in the supply chain. The first is the manufacturer, then the shipper. Often, the shipper is the manufacturer themselves, or else it's a logistics company, for example, DHL. The final recipient of the goods is the consignee. The data subjects can request to have their names and addresses withheld from these databases, so the data set should be regarded as potentially systematically incomplete. For instance, most shipments to the US retailer Walmart are redacted from this database. But here's some of the information that we can get. So this includes for shipments of garments from India to the United States, it includes consignees, shippers, and all of their contact details that are going to help us recognize single entities later on. There are other trade databases that offer similar data sets that I've used in the past that include Import Genius. And the primary difference between them is that Panjiva does entity recognition themselves and gives you sort of cleaned up bills of lading, whereas Import Genius gives you the raw data. And so it depends a lot on where you think your signal is going to come from, which one you would find most useful. You can also download the raw data from Panjiva. It's just not as readily available. A new similar data source within India is the e-way bills system. which is a similar type of data for domestic truck traffic. My model doesn't currently use this data set because it went live after I started writing the model. We can also get a list of known suppliers of garments within the industry of interest from the Open Apparel Registry. The Open Apparel Registry is an open source aggregation of things like brand supplier lists that help us sort of reconstruct in an open source way the universe of garment and textile suppliers. So we can basically download a list of all of the publicly known garment suppliers in India. And at this point, you're probably thinking to yourself, she's really duplicating a lot of companies in her list. And that's true. And we're going to solve that problem in the next video on entity recognition. But right now, we're looking for every possible data source that can give us information about the business environment of the Indian garment industry. So with this index in hand, we can start thinking about structuring our training data. Our criteria for inclusion in our training data is that a firm has met either one of the following two conditions within the previous 5 years. And this criteria is consistent with the criteria that banks use for excluded entity screening. So the first criterion is that you have been convicted of a crime that is equivalent to forced labor by a labor tribunal in India. And there is a database called Qanun of adjudicated cases in India that if we put our whole index through this database search function, we can come up with a list of companies that have prior records of convictions of forced labor. We consider this an absolute truth. The second way you can end up in my training data is if within the previous 5 years, there have been at least 2 independent reports by an NGO or journalist that you are using forced labor or slave-like conditions in your factory. So here's an example of an NGO that put out a report that has evidence that specific firms are using forced labor. I did write a script that went through my whole index and automatically searched Google News for reports indicating forced labor, but I found that that was unproductive and eventually abandoned it. I found that it was more efficient for experts to just carefully search and record incidences that appeared in the news. And I took all this information and structured it into one giant list. And in the next video, we'll go through how I consolidated that giant list into unique business entities that include companies and all of their subsidiaries that can be discovered in this list. Thanks for watching.